Hello, everyone in the William and Mary community, and welcome to a conversation with Dr. Joseph J. Ellis. My name is Howard Busby, class of 1965, and this is a special welcome to those of you who are participating in our virtual 2021 Traditions Weekend. And that would include graduates and guests celebrating your 50th reunion, as well as members of the Old Guard and the Robert Boyle Legacy Society. Now, from this point forward, I won't be referring to our guest speaker as Dr. Ellis, but rather as Joe, because we've known each other for decades. We both started walking the bricks on campus 60 years ago, graduated in the class of 1965, and were fraternity brothers in Theta Delta Chi. Those of you who recall the fraternity lodges may remember that Lodge 2, the first on the left, the home of Theta Delta, is now the only remaining lodge standing and houses the Daily Grind Coffee House, which is particularly appropriate since no beverages stronger than coffee were ever served in that lodge. Joe will begin shortly by providing an overview of his 2018 book, American Dialogue, The Founders and Us. He details in that book how 4 US presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, approached 4 significant and divisive issues facing us today: race, economic disparity, the role of law, and foreign policy. They illustrate the key role of civil discourse. This conversation is critical at this pivotal moment in time at William and Mary. As an institution, we have made a commitment to expand our engagement around themes of democracy and citizenship through courses, programs, and activities involving community members and alumni around the nation and the world. Let me introduce Professor Paul Mapp, who will facilitate the conversation with Joe using questions submitted from registrants and the William and Mary community, including students. Professor Mapp is an associate professor and director of graduate studies in the history department. He joined William and Mary in the fall of 2003 after receiving a PhD in history from Harvard in 2001, and then spending 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow at the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. He is a historian of the early modern North America and Atlantic world geographic regions, and in addition to other research areas, has been investigating the international history of the American Revolution. Professor Mapp won the 2010 Phi Beta Kappa John D. Rockefeller Faculty Award for Excellence in Teaching. He currently holds general classes on early American history and the American Revolution, and graduate courses on historical research, international approaches to the American Revolution, and the West in early American history. So it's clear that Professor Mapp is uniquely qualified to moderate our session today. And just a few more words about Joe's background. After William and Mary, he received his master's and doctoral degrees from the nation's 3rd oldest college. That would be Yale. Of course, his most significant doctoral degree was his honorary doctorate in 1998 from our university. Joe is one of our country's preeminent scholars of American history. An educator, he has taught at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, Williams College, the University of Massachusetts, and Mount Holyoke College. A prolific author, he won the National Book Award for nonfiction for American Sphinx, the character of Thomas Jefferson. And in 2001, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for History for his book, Founding Brothers, The Revolutionary Generation. Both books were New York Times bestsellers. His newest work, The Cause, The American Revolution and Its Discontents, 1773 to 1783, will be released later this fall. So Joe, with all that introductory information, it's your turn. Could you provide us an overview of your American Dialogue book from your perspective?
Howard, that was a great introduction. Good to see you, brother. And I began writing this book, American Dialogue, in 2015. I was driven by a sense of our divisiveness as a people. This was prior to the election of Donald Trump. I think very specifically on the race issue, that in the aftermath of Barack Obama's election, there was a good deal of talk about America entering a kind of post-racial American history phase. And I knew that was not going to be true. And I wanted to know why I knew that. And I thought the reason I know that is I spent 7 years studying Thomas Jefferson. Now, in the book opens with race and Jefferson, and it proceeds along that same now and then arc. So race is Jefferson. We look back to Jefferson. And the underlying looking back is based on the assumption that in the same way that the founding generation looked back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, to Thucydides, Tacitus, Cicero, Plutarch, for their wisdom, let's us look back to our classics. The founding generation, Jefferson being one of the more prominent ones, the others being, I think, the seven most prominent being, well, Jefferson, Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Hamilton, Madison. I think Marshall should get in there, but he often doesn't. Of those, anyway, at one point in my thinking, I included climate change in an issue that I wanted to try to look at from a historical point of view, and I was going to use Franklin. I worked on that for 3 months. I care a lot about climate change. The older we get, the more we think about posterity, and the more we think about posterity, the more we realize they're facing a future that could be catastrophic. The other issues were income inequality, and the backward-looking fellow there is Adams. He's the only founder that predicted the Gilded Age and rabid income inequality. And we are in a second Gilded Age. It is distressing. The same nation, the United States, that discovered, invented the middle class is no longer a middle class society. How has that happened, and what are the consequences? Adams has something to tell us there. Under the law, I originally intended something broader. It was based on a belief that the Congress, especially the Senate, had become essentially a dysfunctional body, a place where laws went to die. But it focused in the end on judicial doctrine because it made most sense if you're looking back to the founders there, because the judicial doctrine of the present that is dominant on the Supreme Court is called originalism. And that's what I've tended to focus on in this chapter. The Supreme Court decision that gets most attention is DC versus Heller, which is the decision that found that the Second Amendment guarantees a right to bear arms that is almost unlimited. Those people who embrace that notion will find my chapter unnerving. And finally, I look at foreign policy in which Washington is the major figure. And we think of the farewell address as really one of the seminal statements of the isolationist posture in American foreign policy. But it's also, I argue, it is a realistic estimate of American foreign policy. And Washington's definition of what we call American exceptionalism, he called American uniqueness, is almost diametrically the opposite of what we mean by that phrase today. By our lights, it means that the form of government and the way of life that America represents, we call it the liberal tradition, is transportable to all nations in the world and will eventually triumph. And Jefferson believed that. He went to his death believing that. Washington said that was not true, that our origins were distinctive, unique, and exceptional for reasons that were geographic, and demographic, especially this continent that was an incredible trust fund. And therefore, we should not expect our way of life to be immediately, if you plant Jeffersonian seeds of democracy in the Middle East, they're not going to grow. And in that sense, the decision made just recently by President Biden to remove troops from Afghanistan, which has drawn a lot of criticism in the press today, is a fulfillment of Washington's view that it was always a mistake to attempt to impose a military garrison on the Middle East. It was the same kind of mistake that the Europeans made in the Crusades. With that, let me turn it over to Professor Mapp, who I'm going to call Paul for the rest of the program, if I may.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you. And let me just let me just say right at the beginning, I really enjoyed working with the book in these last few days and this weekend. And in particular, I think there are fewer historians who make a serious effort to look at their subject, their area of specialty in the past, and relate it to the present, and to do so in a really serious and disciplined way that simultaneously does justice to the complexity of 2 centuries ago, but also does justice to the complexity of the contemporary world and to the sort of subtlety of the connections between them. I think it's extremely difficult and quite rare. And
well, Paul, if I may, then let's
come on in.
This a conversation. You can interrupt me and I'll interrupt you. That I thought a lot about that, and there's a preface that talks about it. And like you, I'm a trained historian. I have a PhD and all that good card-carrying historian. And our goal is to recover the past on its own terms as best possible. And you learned that at Harvard. I learned that at Yale.
Sure.
But we all know, as teachers, as living, breathing creatures of now, that we must look back at the past from the present. And that it invariably means that the questions we pose and our perspective on the past is going to influence what we see and how we see it. And there are dramatic examples of this. I mean, Arthur Schlesinger writes The Age of Jackson, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1937. Guess what he discovers in Jackson? Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal. Charles Beard looks back in the early first decade of the 20th century at the Revolutionary Generation and the Constitutional Convention. Guess what he discovers? The robber barons. So that we bring with us baggage that we can't really get rid of, that we can't be objective. We're not mathematicians. History and humanities are different from sciences. We can attempt to be detached. I think that's a worthy goal. But even then, we're always bringing these convictions with us. And so why not say to your reader, as I try to do, look, this is what I'm bringing. And I'm not bringing a series of answers, but I'm bringing a series of questions that are defined by our moment here in the 21st century. And ones, for reasons I've already identified, I think are important.
Look, let me ask you, in sort of following up some of what you're talking about. I mean, so you've spent a lot of time, okay, in a different time. You've had really decades of studying a lot of these different figures.
Right.
Obviously, you've been alive in the present, so you've seen and felt the sort of world change before us. Are there ways when you were working on this book that you could feel that, I'm doing something different in 2015 than I would have done in 1995 or 1985? That is, are there ways in which your experience of the present through your life has helped you to see something different in 1787 or 1776? The way the present has enriched or elicited something from you in your understanding of the past?
I don't think there's been a sort of night and day change or black and white change, but I think there's been a gradual amplification or emphasis on paradox and irony. That the older you get, the more you're capable of understanding your own imperfections. And I began to see the founders from the start as imperfect human beings. If there's a trademark Ellis message on the founders, is that these are all imperfect human beings. And that if you think they're more than that, then you're deluded. And in fact, if they were demigods, what in heaven's name would we have to learn from? But my treatment of Jefferson in this book that you're talking about is pretty tough.
Yeah.
But once you look through the window of race, Jefferson is not going to look so great. But I'm not afraid of doing that now.
Sure.
And I might have been where my early mentor at Yale was a guy called C. Van Woodward.
Sure.
And he's a great man in Southern history. And I went to him to say, I want to do my dissertation on Thomas Jefferson. And he looked at me like I was crazy and said, you're not old enough to write a biography yet. You have to have lived some life. And then if you want to go after Jefferson, he's the second most written about figure in American history after Lincoln. But no, don't do it. Don't do it. So I said, so 25 years later, I wrote a book on Jefferson called American Sphinx.
Sure.
And he said, I should have let you do it. At any rate, I'm going on in a different angle here, but I think as we all get closer to the end than the beginning, our thought process becomes more concerned with, as I said earlier, with posterity. And the founders were really concerned with posterity. That one of the reasons they were always on their best behavior is that they're the first generation in modern history to come of age when the belief in the hereafter was becoming somewhat suspect. And that for them, the only certain way to live forever was to live forever in posterity, in our memory, that they knew we would be sitting here at William and Mary in Vermont talking about them.
Yeah.
That's the reason they preserved all those letters. Well, I'm in that phase now. And certain qualities that you didn't know about as well earlier, like to me, the single most important quality I learned from reading about the Addams family, for example, is resilience. You're going to make mistakes, bad things are going to happen, but resilience. On the race issue, I believe that Martin Luther King was right. He actually got the idea of the words from Theodore Parker, that the arc of the moral universe does bend towards justice. I think that's true. But it's not a straight line up. It's a roller coaster. And in some sense, once you elected Obama, you should have predicted Trump. It's inevitable. And there's my irony again. Maybe we should get off race and get onto some other things, but that's a long-winded answer to your question about what the ways I've grown.
Sure. No, I think I think it's interesting. And, it's actually mentioning your point about posterity. I mean, there were some passages in the book that really caught my attention. I think particularly some about Washington. He was someone who was very conscious of his reputation, in the 18th century, but also I think was thinking, as you mentioned, in the long term. And I did find it heartening that, he was conscious of the imperfections of the Republic, some of its shortcomings, but his concern in one sense about, this intuition, I think, that in the long run, people would look at, what his policy was towards American Indians or towards Native Americans, and that he could see the moral failings, the moral limitations of the Republic, and was trying to counteract them.
He did more than anybody else to try to avoid Indian removal. He really did. And that was, just as you say, Paul, one of the major reasons for it, because he knew that his reputation, and that's the reason he freed his slaves in his will, allegedly on the death of Martha. But when after Washington died and the slaves found out that they were going to stay slaves until Martha died, they started rumors they were going to poison her. And so she freed him right away. But I think, and Washington is the one Virginian in the group. If you take Washington, Jefferson, Madison.
Mhm.
Well, it's Washington and really Marshall, who believed that the revolution intended to create an American nation. And Jefferson, and then especially the later Madison, and most of the other Virginia heroes, to include Patrick Henry, George Mason, Pendleton, and all of them, they thought that it created a confederation of states that were loosely bound together and sovereignty resided in the states. And that was one of the reasons to do that, was to protect slavery. There were other reasons, but that was the main one. And that if you look at Virginia's history, Virginia is the dominant player in the Revolutionary era.
Yeah, yeah.
Adam said in Virginia, all geese are swans. And but then it dominates. You get the Virginia dynasty. You get Washington and this blip where this guy Adams appears for one term. Then you get Jefferson 2 terms, Madison 2 terms, Monroe 2 terms. After that, the only person to ever be president of the United States of Virginia is Tyler, and he snuck in, after Harrison died.
Yeah.
They carry Virginia into decline. They carry Virginia to the Confederacy. And Virginia is no longer a major player as of 1820, 1830. It's in, and it's slavery. That's the ultimate reason for that. So that when you look at history books and they talk about the Revolution of 1800 and Jefferson's election is this great winning of democracy, that's wrong. That's wrong. The 1800 and Jefferson's election is is a reaction to the Federalists, and Jefferson believes that the federal government is a foreign government. Literally, he says that and it has power over foreign policy, but has no power over domestic policy whatsoever. And Madison agrees with that. Monroe agrees with that. Virginia is given to that. And I'll carry it forward. And Howard, you can chime in here if you want to.
Mm-hmm.
When Howard and I were students at William and Mary from 1961 to 65, there was not a single Black student at William and Mary. The civil rights movement was going on. It was like we didn't know about it. Now, William and Mary's changed a lot since that, but the history of the college is embedded in that backward Virginia identity. I think William and Mary is now a national institution, and that and it is, and especially if you live outside Virginia, as I have. You see it, and it is, I think it offers, as a public institution, the finest undergraduate education of any public university in the United States. I mean that. And I think you've got students that will testify, your experience there. But
we do.
Yeah, but I've carried this to a discussion of the decline of Virginia, and I don't want it to go there. But one more thing I'll throw at you that's William Mary related. At some point in time, some students at William Mary are going to start protesting that statue of Jefferson. There is a William Mary graduate. Let me make sure I got his name right. Who we might want to put up a statue of him right next to him. Edward Cole. I don't know whether you've ever heard of Edward Cole. He is a William Mary graduate. He was Madison's private secretary. And he went to Jefferson. He's a little younger than Jefferson, and in 1813, and said, you need to free your slaves. I'm going to free my slaves. And you will set the example that will have an enormous impact on the rest of the Commonwealth. And the letter Jefferson writes to him is extremely disappointing. It says, no, I can't do it. It's not time yet. And you shouldn't do it either. Well, Cole takes his slaves with him west to Illinois, the territory of Illinois, and frees them. There's a famous painting in Illinois State Legislature, Capitol, of him on a barge freeing them. And I think that rather than tear down the Jefferson statue, you put a statue of Cole's up next to him and have them engaged in a conversation. We're not going to tear down the Jefferson Memorial. I think we should build an Adams Memorial right next to it, where they can take turns casting shadows across each other's facades. And but unsolicited advice to William and Mary about how to proceed with Mr. Jefferson.
Sure. Well, look, I mean, and that gets at another larger question. It's almost a philosophical question we can come at from different angles, which is, 2 centuries later, why is it important for us to talk about a particular group of folks from 2 centuries ago? I mean, right. Is it, were there a set of figures whose insights were such that they kind of transcended the moment and they have an interest which transcends their time? Is it that they, established laws and habits of thought and maybe patterns in society that we still live with, so we want to study them then? And of course, there's, there's unease now, I think, about studying, a
dead white males, dead white guys.
Yeah, well, folks who owned other human beings or tolerated the ownership of other human beings. So what is it that, when you think about why you study these folks from a distant period, as again, particular folks, what is it that that makes knowing about them or thinking about them so important for all of us? And it's a big group today. And I think this is something that we're kind of torturing about now.
When people ask me why I studied the founders, I give them my Willie Sutton answer. Willie Sutton was a bank robber. He kept getting caught and then came out and then robbed banks and get caught again. They said, "Why do you rob banks?" He said, "Because that's where they keep the money." The late 18th century, we keep the ideas and the institutions that were the founding moment. It's like the Big Bang in American history that radiates out from it. And we're still living it. It's true. It's distinctive. I mean, you don't hear anybody in Great Britain say, "I wonder what William Pitt would think about Brexit." They don't do that. But because we have a written constitution that establishes the laws, and we still live by them, and it's the first constitution for a republic of nation size ever in modern history. That there's a substantive reason, and it is not because these people were divinely inspired. They were not, and it's not because they weren't sinful. They were just like us, but it's because they're the greatest political generation we've ever been able to generate. It's the gold standard. Now, to students, I'm sure you've seen this. I remember this student at Williams came up to me and said, "I can't talk about slavery. I mean, they were wrong. They were wrong about this, and it's just as simple as right and wrong." And I say, you need to face the question more deeply than that, and it's not easy for them. But like, if you're an anthropologist and you go to Samoa, you don't say to them, all of you should be practicing the child rearing practices or suggestions of Dr. Spock, do you? It's like if you go to England, you don't accuse them of not having the proper accent. The past is a foreign country from which you have much to learn. One in the audiences, I sometimes say, "How many out there are parents?" And then everybody raises their hand in one way or the other. And I say, "Is this familiar? When your children are very young, you can do no wrong. Indeed, you are God." And they pass a line, whether it's metabolic or whatever. And after they cross that line, you can do no right. In fact, in Freudian terms, they want to kill you. And I think that's the pattern that describes the historical posture towards the founders. At one point, they were deified, and now they're vilified. And the right answer is not either one of those options.
Sure. I wonder if if we might go from that might make a nice transition to some of what you talk about in the book about judicial interpretation, the Constitution. And I think, I think it's fair to say that you're, somewhat critical of original intent as a system of constitution.
The chapter there is called, the chapter, if I recall, is called Immaculate Misconceptions.
That's right. That's right. And I wonder, this might be a chance to talk about it. And, maybe I can just ask you is your frustration with original intent as a system of constitutional interpretation, is it with the sort of conception of itself, the conception itself, that this idea that you might go back and find a meaning or a range of meanings in the 1780s? So the sort of doctrine of it, or is it the way it's applied by Supreme Court justices and lawyers and so on? That is the problem sort of law off is history, or is the problem the nature of history itself and the sort of futility of our attempt to find certain kinds of certainty or even sort of limits to our uncertainty in the past?
It's a little bit of both, although it's more the application. There are some people in the Federalist Society, which is the home base for the originalist ideology, who are also very knowledgeable about American history. There's the dean of Georgetown Law School, is PhD from Harvard, as a matter of fact, in history, as well as a Yale law degree. I think it was Kennedy once said he had the best of both possible worlds, a Harvard education and a Yale degree. And what distresses me is that every Supreme Court nominee by a Republican president since 1985 has come from the Federalist Society. There is a spectrum within them, but they lean towards a conservative interpretation to a corporatized, to favor corporations at the favor of labor, and a restriction on federal power, especially federal power that's designed to implement regulation of businesses, or we'll see this probably when to overrule, say, Georgia's position on restriction of voting.
Yeah.
And they derive their authority from the claim that, unlike those liberals who are practicing what they call a living constitution, acknowledging that their opinion represents an expanded understanding of the language of the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like in Brown versus Board of Education, they didn't say that the founders intended, or the 14th Amendment intended education for them, but that was now part of what we understood it to mean. It seems to me that what we've seen in the court, in the Roberts Court, especially in three decisions, the one that I focus on is DC versus Heller on the Second Amendment. The other one is the Bush v. Gore decision that ruled in favor of the Republican candidate based on Florida's, reading the tea leaves in Florida.
Yeah, yeah.
And the worst of all, and I don't even talk about this, is Citizens United.
Yeah, yeah.
And what those decisions, and all those decisions are originalist decisions. And when I get invited to law conferences, and what I say is, look, I am the only man in the room who doesn't have a law degree, but nobody in the room, as far as I know, has a history degree. And you're claiming to be historians.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You're
saying that your interpretation of modern events is based on your understanding of what the people living in 1787, 88 thought.
Right.
And you know nothing about that.
No.
Nothing. And it's a mere imposition. You are the living Constitution people. You're bringing your agenda.
Yeah.
It was the NAACP that brought the agenda to Brown. It's the National Rifle Association that brought the agenda to the decision, DC versus Heller. And so it's frustrating as hell, because you go out there and the people honestly believe they have Second Amendment rights.
Yeah.
And I say, no, you got Scalia rights. You got NRA rights.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Madison didn't mean that when he wrote the Second Amendment.
Right.
The Congress, both houses, didn't mean that when they passed it. The 12 ratifying conventions, Rhode Island didn't participate, didn't mean it. And every judicial decision between 1789 and 2011 didn't mean it either. It's a really overthrow of a base. It's a radical approach towards jurisprudence. It overthrew all the precedents. But it's a fix now. And if you go out there in the great heartlands and you talk to people, they seriously believe that their right to carry an M16 in public is enshrined. And at a time and place where we're seeing a massacre every week, and the rest of the world thinks we are out of our minds, where we have 3% of the world's population and 40% of the guns. That decision stands in the way of the change we need. And so, yeah, I feel passionate about that.
Yeah. I wonder if I might be able to use that to get back to, I think something Howard alluded to earlier, which is, I think there's interest in William and Mary and other places as well in, civic discourse.
Oh, yeah.
Polite and fruitful discussion, sustained argumentation, both in the sense that we go back and forth, but also that we build ideas that are going somewhere. And I wonder if we might think about some of what you're saying about judicial interpretation, and particularly if I understand correctly, this sense of it's not so much people drawing a useful understanding of law or of the present from the past, but in some cases taking their own desires, their own preconceptions, their own agendas, I guess we might say, and finding support in the past.
Right.
And I wonder, and I think some of the questions alluded to this, I mean, well, if there are problems in the way we're talking about society and politics today, and I think most people there are, there's a degree of rancor and partisanship. Is there a way we can get some insight into what's going on now, perhaps some counsel about how we might find our way to a more fruitful discussion from, I think, studying the past? Or maybe a different way to phrase the question is our tendency to sort of impose our understanding on the past rather than to try to learn from human experience, is that the root of our problems today? So I've kind of asked you two distinct questions, which may meet somewhere in the middle. So just whichever one you want to talk about.
Okay. Well, first of all, I completely agree and really heartily support the college's commitment to the creation of a civic discourse. And I think that in many colleges and universities now, the humanities are suffering and they're being cut. I just saw Yale Emmy magazine said they're going the other way. They're building it up. And I hope William Mary goes that way too. You can bring the social sciences in as well. But that the preface to my book says the Constitution isn't a series of solutions, it's a framework in which to argue about what the solutions are. And that argument itself is the answer. Okay? And we have lost that capability as a people. Now we can blame it partly on the internet, and that's certainly true. I often want, what would Jefferson say about the internet? He'd think in some ways he'd love it. That less than 30% of the high school graduates in the United States now can pass the civics test that is required of all immigrants. Something is failing at the K through 12 level. And I think that creating in a faculty that thinks of itself as a faculty, an agreement, we're going to set up, let's say you're going to set up a program that's going to try to work at what a civic education we have. And that would mean creating a debate in the faculty that would permit these ideas to be tossed back and forth.
Sure.
Now, I speak as a person who served most of his career in Northeastern liberal arts colleges, most of them selective or highly selective. You cannot have that discussion in many of those places right now, including at places like Harvard and Yale, and Amherst and Williams and Mount Holyoke. Political correctness has reached such a toxic level that the issue you raised earlier about the founders,
Sure.
I mean, I'm a firm believer that we need to know a lot about Native Americans and the indigenous people. I'm in favor of that.
Yeah.
I think we should learn more about women in American history in the earlier period. I mean, I spent a lot of time with Abigail. She's my sweetheart back there. And slavery is an issue that obsesses me.
Yeah.
But there is a mainstream narrative that the student needs to know. Okay. And it has to do with the coming of the revolution. It has to do with the Civil War, and that the political history and the narrative that goes with that is something that we need to have as part. And the other things are important, and it's just that they cannot become the main narrative. And I think in the profession, as you know as well as I, that's somewhat the way it is now. I think in some ways, William and Mary is positioned to be able to have that conversation better than a lot of institutions that I know about personally, and make it a faculty seminar and get some money. Get Mellon to give you $1 million and or 500,000 for a year, and it really is a discussion of what the liberal arts is.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really a discussion of what we mean by a liberal arts education. And William Mary's positioned to do that in a way that's wonderful, and the nation desperately needs it. I tried to argue that every high school, every state in the union must require its high school graduates to pass the civics test that I described earlier. And I try to work through Gilder Lehrman to do that, and they said it's too big a task. But part of the reason that people are vulnerable to outright lies and conspiracy theories is there's no evidentiary foundation on which they are thinking. They are, in other words, they are vulnerable because they don't know anything. They have no historical memory that will provide them with resilience when they're exposed to all these outright lies.
Would it be fair to say, and I think this will probably be my last question, although, I'd like to keep going because we're just...
They let us go, Paul, we'll go as far as they let us go.
We're just scratching the surface, but, they're going to turn the cameras off,
Yeah.
But would it be fair to say that what you're trying to do with this book about dialogue, it's not... it's not so much to say that you're right or somebody else is wrong,
right?
But to try to stimulate and model a discussion among people who disagree about what's right and wrong, and about, what's true and false, about many other things as well. That includes, questions that would have been of interest to Thucydides and Tacitus and Adams and John Marshall,
right?
As well as questions that I think are especially pressing for us today. Some of which are old questions, some of which I think maybe weren't taken up so well 200 or 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, right.
We're trying to find a way to expand the range of discussion, so at places like William and Mary, we can get together and we can practice talking and we can practice thinking.
Right.
It's reason.
And there are departmental divisions and disciplinary divisions, but if you throw a pile of money in front of them, they'll come. And they will create something, and it'll be important because it's their creation. So if they're teaching in a course, it's something they did. Okay. But absolutely, my writing comes out of my teaching. I saw those two as equal sides of my professional identity, and I couldn't wait to go in there and throw the red meat on the table and let them go after it. And and a lot of the books I've written came out, but that yes, and it is so desperately necessary in the United States right now, because it is almost, I mean, everybody turns on their own TV program and their own app, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we've got to get past that. And higher education is going to have to compensate for some of the deficiencies that have been generated in primary and secondary education. And that's a big task. But at William and Mary, do you read the exams and the papers of your students?
I do.
Yeah. You don't have a bunch of TAs, right? Yeah.
I do not. No,
yeah.
My students have strong opinions about this.
Yeah, I know, but
I didn't read them as closely, but no, I do read them.
But like a lot of the people that are historians and teach at universities, they never read their undergraduate papers.
Oh no.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah,
I do.
Yeah.
I do. Look, this is, I mean, you guys can't cut the camera off when I'm praising the school, right? You know?
Yeah. I mean, well, okay. We don't want to go too much further in this, but
but there's something important going on here.
The civic side of this is extraordinarily appropriate right now. Yeah, it's not just bad. It's an essential kind of commitment. And one of the ways I'd put it historically, and James Baldwin said this, they said, we all think it's really difficult for a people to this large over this large a continent to become a democracy, or to remain a democracy. That's nothing compared to becoming a multiracial democracy. What we're trying to do in the United States has never been done by a modern nation of any size before. And we should expect every time there's a step forward, there's going to be a half a step backward. And one of the things that the Trump presidency exposes as an airburst in the night is that there are a lot more people that don't believe in that than we realized. But that it's the arc of the moral universe is going to keep going forward. And in the year 2045, whites are going to become a statistical minority. Then you can expect a real backlash again. But that civics doesn't mean just biracial, but in the United States, it's the single biggest problem to me. And William and Mary, whose racial history is not the greatest,
absolutely,
okay, is a good place for that very reason, to face its own history and to move forward. And I'd love if you could help do that, Paul.
No, I think that is what we're trying to do. And this is, I'll close, Howard, and turn it over to you. I mean, I think there's a lot of us here in different departments, different disciplines, different ages, different backgrounds. I mean, we're trying to take a frank look at past in all its glories and all its shame, to try to understand that. And I think we all know in all our the full range of humanity, we're going to be living together. And we're trying to live together better by learning how to talk together better. And again, to stimulate our thought, to figure out ways that we can, work together and address our problems collectively. And I think your book is a contribution to thinking about ways we can do that, drawing from the past, commenting on the present, drawing on your career. And so it fits very well, I think, with the William and Mary education. I think, your point about professors here, reading the papers and everything, which we do, which is why we're so tired. But no, it's a sign of respect for the students and a kind of commitment to their education, just as they're committed to helping us and pushing us to try to be better professors. So I think there's a lot of ways in which alumni, in which scholars, in which students, in which everyone working here, in which we're part of a collective enterprise. And it's not easy. There'll be all kinds of challenges, but I think it is something as a school that we can be proud of, even though there's all kinds of stuff we're arguing about today. And in a sense, that's good, because it's through those arguments that we're going to try to find common solutions to address our different concerns. So as you can tell, historians, professors, maybe it's William and Mary folks, we can talk a lot, but I'm going to turn it over to Howard so we can make this a finite event.
Well, Joe and Paul, that was a dynamic conversation and great food for thought and civil discussion for all of us going forward. Joe, after knowing you for 6 decades, I'd paraphrase that song and say, still brilliant after all these years. Thanks for being with us and for your continuing connection and support for William and Mary. And Paul, thank you as well for your guidance of the discussion and the several insights you provided. It's clear why you have excelled in your research and teaching in the classroom. We really appreciate your participation as well. And for those of you watching our online program today, thank you for being here. And we hope you enjoyed your time with us. We look forward to the days when we can gather again in person on campus. But in the meantime, stay in touch with your William and Mary. Take care.